Hi, I'm Janice.
And I'm Darren.
And this is Event Horizon. So today we're going to pick up something we've referenced pretty regularly in previous episodes, what it means to be awake. But before we do that, we'd like to revisit the last episode where we took up the question of whether the world has arrived at this challenging place we're in by chance or design. So Darren, I wondered if you could get us started by sharing some of the comments and reflections you've heard.
Yeah, so I think that episode really resonated with people, even though it was also a fairly intense episode as well in terms of reflecting on changes that have happened in the world. I know that some people shared with me that they felt less alone because they have noticed some of these things. They've been tracking it, even if not scientifically, just in their own personal life journey, like you and I talked about. And they're wondering if other people are noticing it too, realizing they're not crazy. There does seem to be a precipitous descent of some kind. And again, it comes down to what's really causing that. They saw us treating the issue with gravity, but we're also positive in terms of the kind of response we can have, taking control of our lives and having agency over what happens in the future. So it begins by taking seriously the situation, but then asking questions about how can we counter that? How can we be positive in our response? So I think a lot of people resonated with that. I've actually heard that a few times from different reflections on our podcast episodes, is that we get it. We know what's going on. We understand the intersection of these different important issues. Taking it seriously or noticing what's going on, or definitely noticing this key moment, this inflection point in human history, which is behind the reason why we called this podcast Event Horizon. They also feel the same thing, and they feel more hopeful knowing that we are tracking that, but also, again, trying to be positive in terms of how we can move through this really key time, this passage in our civilization's history. I think the last thing I'll say, too, is that some people have reflected that it is tied to the meaning crisis in general. And I touched this a bit in the episode. When you are told underlyingly, even if not right to your face necessarily, but the implications of reductionistic materialism and the notion that our mind and our consciousness is just an epiphenomenon of our brain, is that there really is no meaning, no purpose behind life. It's all a happy accident that came together, that when it unwinds, there's nothing more, and there was nothing really meaningful behind it to begin with. So I hear from some people that they're happy to hear us talk about spirituality as well as these really serious societal issues. And I know that'll touch on what we're going to discuss today as well in terms of a shift we're noticing in society overall. And again, the question of what it means to be an awake person. What is this awakening that we've referenced a few times?
Yeah, this question of meaning is a big one, and I'm really glad we're going to talk about that because it's very much intrinsically tied up in this larger question of, what is awake? And I know we all throw that around a lot, and I think we all have slightly different ideas of it, but it does seem to converge upon a certain set of things. So I'm glad we're going to talk about that. Last episode when we spoke, shared trends I'd noticed, but it was hard to find concrete data points that were easy to share in the episode. But ironically, or not, because synchronicity seems to be a prominent feature of daily life these days for everybody. As you know, within a week of us doing that episode, a whole bunch of data points dropped that specifically speak to that. And there is a design at play. Don't know much about the why. We can speculate, and that's always fun. But that it is feels even more certain. So, for example, there was an American Health and Nutrition, a second opinion roundtable with health experts. It was chaired by Senator Ron Johnson. In this roundtable, there was a bunch of really interesting data shared. Jillian Michaels, for example, went on a rant, I'll say, because it was very powerful. And as part of that, she basically made the contention that chronic disease is an extinction-level event, and it's largely been driven by degradation of food. And I quote her, "What has happened to us? I'm here to tell you that in the late 70s and the early 80s, just when I was noticing too, a sinister series of events converged to change food and subsequently health indefinitely. We were blindly trusting that the powers that be would never betray us. It seemed unthinkable to question whether a corporation would poison us for profit, and it was this betrayal of trust that allowed them to insidiously infiltrate every part of our lives." She goes on to share a bunch of very concrete data, as well as its linkages to inflammation and a variety of the chronic diseases that we all struggle with, and just goes off on why it is the determinants of health, which we've been studying and know a lot about, as I said last time, have never been factored in. And these are all what food's available, what's in the food, where there are food deserts, what you can actually get at a a lot of stores, especially small communities or rural communities or impoverished communities can't get high quality food. And they revealed, and it's part of this, that there are actual differences in what's in American food, even in the same product. So, for example, Vannie Harry and Jason Karp talked about Kellogg's, like Kellogg's cereal. So there is the version of the cereal that's sold here in the United States is actually pumped full of all sorts of toxic stuff that's not allowed in other places. You can, they looked at the side of the boxes and can see there's a difference in the length, the number of ingredients, as well as the composition of the ingredients. Jason Karp said that after watching it go on, he reached out to Kellogg's, and Kellogg's basically said that American children prefer the brighter colors and that they're going to continue to sell the more toxic versions as long as it's compliant with relevant laws, which is an interesting piece, right? Because that's one of the questions. Why are there so many more lax laws about what's in our food, what's in our water, what's in our air here, what's in our makeup than anywhere else? I think that speaks to a lot of what the priorities have been here, who has power. Another thing I saw last week was Robert Reich. He's an economist. For those of you who don't know, he's quite well known and very credible. He wrote that there are now 16 centibillionaires worth $100 billion or more. They've grown 4.4 billion this year and are worth a collective $2.4 trillion. 16 people. That's 4.14% of the U.S. 2023 GDP. That's insane. So the gap in wealth has just been growing and growing and growing, and we're seeing that reflected everywhere. And I would posit that it is partially by design. It's greed, but if you can make us afraid, you make us easy to mold and program. And the last thing I'll share, there was actually quite a bit that came out right in the aftermath, and I thought, wow, synchronicities galore here. We could totally redo this episode. There was one more, a New York Times article that talked about as schools proliferate, more than 700 students are arrested. Arrest and detention for children as young as 10 years old. So from 2000 to 2022, there were a total of 50 active shooter incidents in elementary and secondary schools and a total of 18 active shooter incidents at post-secondary institutions. You can't find active shooter data prior to the mid-1990s because it wasn't a thing. So that has definitely been this ongoing increasing trend. And I know those of us with children are really noticing it because, the conversations that people are having to have with their kids about school and what to watch out for and backpacks and public conversation about not taking away guns, but making sure there's more guns, more places is just an anathema. It's very different than when you and I were growing up, for sure. I could go on because there was more, but I thought I would just drop those specific pieces of data that came out since we did our episode last.
Yeah, I'd like to reflect on a couple of those different ones because, first of all, regarding the gun thing, I know that I mentioned to you when we spoke yesterday that I rode my motorbike down to Georgia to get coffee yesterday, and I saw a political sign for someone running for Congress, and literally the entire sign was a person's name running for Congress, and the picture was a giant picture of an AK-47. That was the political slogan. The person's name for Congress and a giant picture of an AK-47. And the fact that that is normal now, quote unquote, was just shocking to me and reminded me of how much things have slid. Because when you think about this desensitization that happens over time that you just spoke to, things that would have been bizarre 20 years ago, but when you have this incremental shift, even though it's happening fairly quickly, it erodes a little bit every year to the point where people don't even question anymore when these things happen. And like you said last time with the school shootings, a lot of people tune out because at this point they recognize that nothing's really happening politically to stop this, to change it. And I know that for me as a parent, you basically just hope your kids will get through school without having one of those incidents. And I remember hearing something about this little girl and her parents had bought her these new shoes that would light up and they thought they were really cute. And the girl said, "Oh, I don't want to wear those." And they said, "Why not?" And she said, "Well, because if there's a shooter, an active shooter, I'm going to be an easy target." So for a little girl to have to worry about that kind of thing is just demonstrating how broken our culture is, right? That we even have to consider those kind of things and that a 10-year-old or whatever has to consider those kinds of things. The other thing I wanted to say too on the food piece and the fact that there's different ingredients here than there are in other countries, this is, again, where we get this weird relationship with the government in America. So a lot of people have this notion that the government's dark and nefarious, which, again, like you hinted at a minute ago, there are a lot of signs of these deep nefarious programs going on beneath the scenes. But what that ends up meaning also is that some people just assume that they don't even trust what the FDA or whatever would say. They're like, just let us have whatever food we want. And because of that, the politicians therefore enact laws where they're pretty slack on the kind of ingredients that can come in because people don't trust the government making decisions for their foods. And so these different food manufacturers take advantage of that. And they know, like you spoke about last time, these little things we do subtly, subliminally to change people's behavior about what they choose to eat, what they choose to buy. Things like bright colors people do like, even though we know food coloring and the chemicals that go into food coloring are one of the most detrimental kind of chemicals in food. And yet, as Americans, we still do it because we like big and bright and those kinds of things.
Yeah. Sometime it might be good to do an episode on this question of trust, because I hear you. And I mean, I know we both see it. I'm sure everybody sees it. There is this fundamental sense of distrust, and I get it, because there's clearly been some pretty big secrets that shouldn't have been kept for so long. And there are elements in the decision-making spaces that are not good for us. Don't have the average person or just the collective in mind. And yet, I'm sure it's not the whole story. I'm not inclined to go all the way to, well, it's all horrific. I worked in a university for a lot of years. I know there are a lot of people who see the university as the enemy. I can say they're just people. They're just people. And there is multifaceted and as many agendas as you can imagine. And a lot of them are really, really good. So I know that that's the case. It's just a matter of how do we discern, right? And then how do we collectively see what we need to see and then bring pressure or influence where it's most needed. And I think it's this part of the way we do it here. We sort of work it out, looking at all the different pieces together.
I agree. And actually, I've been reflecting on that a lot, actually. We've discussed it a few times in our conversations, because what ends up happening is you have all of these narratives that begin to form in our culture, and they get perpetuated through social media, like we talked about last time. And because we don't have any one coherent source of news, and even if we did it, now half of the country wouldn't trust it anyway. Because of that, you get some really strange conspiracy theories. Now, while on the one hand, we talked about how that notion, this term, conspiracy theory, has been used by these different government agencies deliberately to try to distract people from things that are happening that are nefarious, that they don't want them looking into. At the same time, the problem is there's this spillover effect where all of these notions get put forward that are fictional, that are not based in reality. And people believe those as well. In fact, it gets to the point where if anyone says, did you know the government's doing this now? They'll tend to believe it just because there are these other things that are happening that really are based in fact. So as an example that I know I brought up with you, here where I live in North Carolina, I was spared from the wrath of the storm that just came through, but I have many friends who live in the Asheville area, and that's where I used to live up until the end of 2022, who've been heavily impacted and really feel frustrated. They feel hurt. They feel alone. They feel scared. And because they don't see this immediate reaction, because the challenge is the roads have been knocked out and all these kinds of things because of the flooding and the devastation, they assume that maybe the government doesn't really care about them. And then what ends up happening is some people are saying, they're actually perpetuating these myths, saying things like, did you know the military is actually not even going into Asheville? And I've seen people that I know in social media saying, that's ridiculous. There's helicopters over me right now. I know the military here. They're trying to help. But that, again, adds to people's paranoia. And it even goes to the point where some people are buying into this notion that this was a geoengineered storm, that people are promoting these myths like, did you know this hurricane wasn't even on radar until the very last minute, as if it was like magically, poof, created by the government right before it hit Florida or something. Again, the challenge here is that we might laugh at that and think it's a little bit far-fetched. But as you and I both know, once you get into the weeds of what actually has gone on historically and how different 20th century history is from what we are taught, you can understand why people go here. And the challenge is if you haven't developed a really high degree of discernment, if you haven't been taught critical thinking skills, and if you don't have the time and resources, like we discussed before, to actually get into these things, it becomes incredibly difficult to sort the wheat from the chaff. And again, that is also part of the design, as you and I have talked about many times.
Yeah, I'm really glad you said that. First, I just want to pause and say for anybody out here who's in that area, Nashville, or any of the affected areas, or who have loved ones, please know that we're keeping you in our thoughts and meditations. That was just, wow, what an experience. Big wake-up call for all of us, right? So thank you for mentioning that. And as a psychologist, I know the negative is really sticky. Like there are reasons that our mind gravitates to the negative more than the positive. It actually takes longer to recall positive associations, memories, thoughts than the negative stuff, probably because evolutionarily speaking, you just didn't have a lot of time to evaluate whether the tiger was going to kill you or not. You just needed to get out of the way. But it does mean that we're really receptive to negative messages. And like you said, with social media and the potency of messaging, and sometimes I think the purposeful use of the stickiness to glom on a bunch of other messages makes it super confusing. And I want to say, I don't know what's true and what's not. I do tend to assume if the language is assuming that the government is this hegemonic force and all millions on the government are conspiring to do something like create a storm, I'm like, that's just not likely at all for all sorts of logistical reasons. It's just kind of not possible. And then the other would be the idea that they're all powerful, like you can manifest a storm like of that magnitude. I think I heard that it dropped 4 or 40 trillion gallons. I mean, imagine how much water that is.
So a couple of things there. Yeah, absolutely. The storm that dropped on the Asheville region was a 1 in 1,000 year kind of storm. That's how much water it was. It just kept raining really heavily for days on end. Now, a couple of points I want to bring up here. Yes, to your point about, again, social media and the things that end up on there. Just as an experiment, sociologically, the other day, I was looking at what kind of threads would come up, what kind of memes would come up on Facebook. And I was kind of shocked to see that 1 out of every 40 or 50 of these would be basically talking about a flat Earth. And I thought, wow, we really are going backwards. Like even things that have been well established in consensus reality, which I know that gets tricky talking about that, but that's one of those. And again, even that's being questioned. So I understand why people, again, when they feel alone, when they feel like there's something that seems against them, right? This has to do with what we were talking about. Some people do, I think, have this sense that is real, that it's touching on something valid, that something is trying to undermine them. Something is trying to prevent human potential from flourishing. I think that's true. The challenge is, again, where we end up projecting our frustration and how easy it is to channel that into misinformation. And then, again, the consensus in terms of all of us coming together to try to create a better world becomes very difficult because we can't even decide or agree on what's actually happening. Last point I want to make, too, that you touched on there is absolutely this notion that the government is doing something is kind of silly. Like, our neighbors make up the government, and it's many, many agencies, different organizations, many private contractors. That's a huge part of what actually is part of the government, are these private contractors working on contracts with the government and various agencies. And again, these are our neighbors. These are people across the spectrum of consciousness development with different worldviews. Some are secular, some are religious. You get it all. And so trying to make that the boogeyman is dangerous. Now, at the same time, and again, this is the nuance that we try to pull out in this show, when people talk about this notion of there being this deeply embedded elite group that is not what you see on the surface of our apparent democracies, but something much more insidious, that's much deeper down, that pulls the levers behind the scenes, people that you would never know, you would never seen their faces, you probably never heard their names, but they are the ones actually doing this. I actually do hear these notions, and this is one of the things I was going to bring up last time we didn't have time, is I remember a friend of mine who is really centrally involved in trying to get the UAP matter to move in Europe, actually, amongst different governments there. He's really centrally involved in that process. And we talked to this one politician about, can we potentially pull together people that have this conversation? And this guy kind of smirked at him and said, if there's anything I've learned over decades in politics, the people you think are running the world are not the people running the world. And this wasn't some social media guru kind of saying this. Was a guy who was kind of a bit of a cynical politician who had been in it long enough to know that the way things look on the surface is not the way they look deep down. So this is the trick here. This is the trickiness of this, the challenge of this, is that we know there are some control structures. We kind of talked about that last time, that while we can't name them specifically because they're good at hiding and they cover their tracks and whatnot, when you look at the pattern of the data, it sure seems to tell a story of a deliberate attempt to negate human potential and to keep people within a narrow frame so that they're easily controlled, so that the power, the wealth stays within that one elite group. And it happens in a way that you still let people believe that by eating these toxic foods and whatnot and making those choices and not having the government dictate what can be in their foods, they're actually living the good life. This is the challenge, because it's really difficult to begin to know how to untangle that yarn and know what is going on. But, this is something we will continue to, I think, try to address in all the nuance on this show.
Thanks. I really agree. And I think it leads really nicely into where we want to go, because I don't think we're going to know for a while who those people are and how far and vast this network is. But part of, at least for me, when I think about awakening, part of what that means to me is an acknowledgement that, yes, we're on a planet where there's some pretty dicey stuff going on. There's some nefarious actors. Absolutely. No doubt about that. But the potential for what we can become and the way that we can make that happen through understanding consciousness is emblematic for me of what it means to be, quote unquote, awake or awakening. I'm not going to say wide awake, because I don't know that any of us in a human body, or very, very few of us, can see all of it, but that's really not the point. But one of the signs that I look for, and we'll get into this a little bit later, is how much do we wear our victimhood? When there's just a lot of pointing of fingers and blaming and trying to figure out who is at the heart and hold them to account. While I do think that there is definitely some accounting that has to happen and some amends making and some justice, I don't think that an emblem of being awake is spending a lot of time thinking about that. I think that's a given where we are. I think every soul who incarnated now, and this is just me, and I know not everybody believes this, but it's just how I feel, knew exactly what we were coming into. So it's not a great use of time to blanket blame everybody, especially since we really can't know, which makes discernment really important, which is what you referenced earlier. But I wonder if, before we sort of get into kind of what we look for in ourselves and others, I think one of the big questions we had is we both feel like there is, in addition to this nefariousness that it seems to be blossoming and trying to, make its move, there's also this beautiful blossoming of hope and love and awareness and recognition that is also happening, it seems, en masse. So how are you recognizing that in the world, Darren?
Yeah, and just to underline what you're saying there, these go hand in hand, actually. It's not coincidental or surprising or paradoxical that these are arising at the same time, because as we discussed last time, polarity drives evolution, and we're talking about consciousness evolution, not physiological evolution. And so, as I mentioned, when you have this heavy contrast that is brought to light, then people begin to notice what's happening, and it makes them ask questions about, what does it mean to be here? Who am I ultimately? What is this ultimately? And it helps to wake people up because they see the contrast. So that's interesting in itself. And I know that you and I have had private conversations where we've talked about these nefarious forces. The one thing they have working against them is that they can't cohere together very well for very long, because they have this service to self kind of mentality where they're always trying to one-up each other, and they are so attached to their individual ego that they really can't help each other unless they really think it's helping them. It's a very transactional way of doing things, and those kinds of structures just don't last very long because of their very nature and what's composing them. So that's part of the reason why this awakening is happening. And I also think, as we've touched on a couple times before, that just natural ecosystems in general are always driving towards harmony. Same way, if you have some sort of injury to your brain, the plasticity in your brain will allow some other region that wasn't originally covering a certain kind of action or functionality to pick up for it. So this is something that's inherent in nature. And again, I think this is something that should make us more optimistic, that even while these forces that are kind of low vibe, that would like to control and prevent growth, they can only have so much sway in the totality, and that the underlying nature of reality is to want to drive towards harmony, and emergence is a natural aspect of the cosmos. But one way I would say that this has shown up that I have noticed before is coming through the UFO phenomenon, that many people came in perhaps curious about the fact that the government seemed to be finally admitting that there's something to this notion of UAP, that is unidentified anomalous phenomena, meaning not just aerial, but there's different mediums, sometimes in the ocean, sometimes moving into a mountain. So it's not just things in the air, it's things that do not fit conventional explanation. And because of that, and because there's a strange element to it, right, this high strangeness aspect is part and parcel with the phenomenon. And so because of that, many people, when they begin to become interested in that, end up feeling like something is communicating with them. And they begin to recognize somehow the entire cosmos is conscious and they're a part of this. And that relationship comes alive to them because of this. And they start noticing things like synchronicity. Earlier on, you mentioned synchronicity. Right after we did that episode, there was some data that came out. I think that was actually testimony before Congress that was basically underlying what we were saying. So synchronicity begins to happen. And I would point out here, that's to be expected, because once you recognize that this is a conscious relational cosmos where everything's entangled, then as you begin to work with it and pay attention, and like any relationship, feed into it, make contributions, then you get something in return. And this is kind of what I see happening. And that's one of the elements that's driving awakening when I pay attention.
I love that. Thank you. For me, I know we've talked about this a lot, but I haven't crafted a definition of awakening. That would be kind of an interesting exercise, right? Because we use it so loosely, everybody, but I don't know that we have an agreement. But as I've said to you, I really think of awakening as remembrance. It's like this slow, steady remembering of what the deeper truth is about who we are, because we are not these bodies. There was a before, there is an after, there is an out there is this constant communication. I feel very certain about that. I'm not asking anybody else to feel certain about that. That's the process of remembering. But I think it does help us to understand some of the trends that we've seen. Like, we all know that there's been a pretty marked decrease in people identifying as religious and affiliated with a church of any sort or a formal religion of any sort. But at the same time, there's been this increase in numbers of people who identify as spiritual. You and I were talking about the Pew data, or a little bit earlier, because Pew studies this. They follow trends. And right now, as of 2023, they've absolutely found the trending of decline in religiosity. But overall, 70% of U.S. adults consider themselves spiritual in some way, because they think of themselves as spiritual people. For me, looking at the signals of this, okay, this planet is definitely going through some massive hardship, but I think it's really revealing. The hardship is, we're seeing for the first time, and I'm not going to rush in there with my sword and try to start taking off everybody's heads. I'm like, okay, we're seeing some pretty hard stuff. It's been there for a while, but we're also seeing deeper truths about who we are, what this is. And what's an offing for us, it seems, is this deeper remembrance of not only truths about who we are and our eternal nature, but truths about physics, about the nature of reality, about what's possible in all these areas that we've always assumed, you have to travel, you have to actually get in a ship and travel many great distances for many, many years. Well, maybe not if there's wormholes. Maybe not. Maybe it could just be immediate. Maybe some of the stuff we saw on Star Trek is actually very real. So all that stuff is getting ready to be recognized, acknowledged, and possibly used by us. So one of the signs I see personally in my life is just not only my own experiences, but I don't know about you. I think I do know about you because we talk about this a lot. Tons of people showing up. Individuals, people I would never have expected to be interested in some of the topics I'm interested in. People being drawn to groups talking about consciousness, talking about UAP, people being drawn to classes and to books, more and more people writing books, more and more organizations forming to not only sort of reveal the things that have been unseen, but also start to talk about consciousness and the nature of reality. I mean, you and I both know you get in through the UAP door and within a half an inch of there, you're in the world of high strangeness and consciousness. So I'm seeing tons of that. And lots of people starting to have anomalous experiences that they don't necessarily understand. I would caution people to not assume that if you're having anomalous experiences, you're wide awake, or what you're seeing is somehow representation of truth. You know, we can talk about that a little bit later. That gets a little tricky because we do bring our human filters to it. And if you don't know what your filters are, it can really affect what you see back. But more and more people having dreams, having clearly synchronicities. I think lots of people are having that, having just knowings, having clear telepathy, having all the different clairs. It's so much that I feel like every week I have new conversations with people. It's like the world is lighting up. And that's happening at the same time that we have this deep darkness being revealed. So generally, even though when I wake up in the morning, sometimes I feel like it's a little bit like putting on wet, cold clothes again. Mostly, I would say most days, I just feel like, wow, I'm so grateful I get to be alive at this amazing time, because it feels like there's definitely stuff happening. Last thing I'll say before I pass it to you is I have a UAP community group, and we met the other night. And the first thing, people got in the room, and we have more and more people coming because just, more and more people are feeling it, curious. And somebody said, what is going on? Do you all feel what is something, right? Something's happening. It's a big moment. And there was unanimous agreement that everybody's feeling it. Even the people in our group who tend to not really, they'll definitely are open to other people saying that stuff, but that's just not, they've never been comfortable saying it. But I'd say pretty much everybody was feeling it. So that like feelings things, sensing things, and the willingness to talk about it are also signs I see that there is a collective awakening.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And I think I've mentioned to you privately, I know I've talked about this in my classes a little bit, because it's been very compelling. Then I've seen people who just a few years ago would have absolutely identified as physicalists and as atheists. In other words, believing that there was no ultimate purpose behind life, that everything is basically reducible to biological systems and whatnot. And because of experiences, they have had their worldview turned upside down. And now they understand there is this meaningful drive behind life, that meaning actually undergirds everything that we perceive as physical reality. And they also are in touch with something like what they would call God or source. Again, God is a term with a lot of baggage culturally, but if we think about it in terms of some sort of sense of some creative force behind everything that drives creation, this kind of teleological principle, we talk about it in theology, that seems to be present. Now, something else that's interesting to me here is that when I think about even when we began this podcast and each of these different crisis points we talked about, what's amazing is each one of those has moved further along towards some sort of singularity moment or something. Because when we look at that storm that just happened in Asheville, for instance, and major parts of North Carolina, Georgia, South Carolina to some degree, I think, what we're seeing there, of course, is when you have all that warm water in the ocean, that's what drives the engine of these storms. They become really huge. So when these tales are spun about this is actually a government machine that creates these massive storms, not only does that just make people angry at something that probably is not true, but on top of that, it distracts us from the fact that climate change is what's driving these massive storms. And this is exactly what was predicted. And this, again, speaks to the confusion of our times, because I'm sure climate scientists are out there saying, hello, people, we said this is exactly what would happen. When you have all this warm water in the ocean, you're going to have these massive storms, and they're going to be much more destructive. And we're now beginning to see that. But even you and I talked this week about some movements that have happened in AI, right? Where OpenAI, that initially was going to be a non-profit and was very much set up to benefit all of humankind, we're seeing one person after another resign from that organization because they feel like their ethical concerns are not being considered. And now it's turned into a for-profit company. So I was looking at this week and saying, is anybody else noticing this? These different data points are all marching towards this event horizon that was behind the whole impetus of this podcast. And this sure looks like the Terminator plot setting up in terms of the prequel to the Terminator movies. And again, what's bizarre is because people are so confused and distracted and overwhelmed, we just march on, like get up, go to work, do the same thing the next day while these things are happening. But I want to underline, for every one of those elements, it seems to tick further towards midnight. 2 minutes to midnight means we're really close to disaster. At the same time, the awakening seems to be happening. And this is definitely, I think, pointing to the fact that there is help from outside of the frame to some degree. It's not just that people happen to be noticing the contrast more and therefore remembering or waking up like we're talking about. They're actually being aided and contacted by other intelligences. And I know we have probably a diverse audience, and some people will find that more difficult to believe than others. But I think this is definitely in the mix. And when I talk to people, it's not just that they are having dreams or something or some sort of remembrances, you would say, but actually that they are having contact experiences. You touched on it a little bit, right? Telepathic downloads. And another word that I like that I think kind of is somewhere between awakening and remembering is resonating. So I like to give this analogy in my class of, it's called sympathetic resonance. If you actually have a piano, and especially if you have the sustain pedal down and you sing a note, the piano string will also make that same note, that same sound. And so this is kind of what's happening here. Now, another thing I think I want to touch on here when we talk about how sometimes the distortion, the darkness, the nefariousness actually highlights the positive, even though it wants to do the opposite, is exactly what I see happening in Asheville, what we just talked about. Is I have friends there who on the one hand are overwhelmed and so saddened by people losing their homes and whatnot, but also so encouraged by people coming together, forming community bonds, and actually coming alive with a sense of purpose that's much more empowering than anything they felt before. Because instead of going to their 9-to-5 job, again, I'm not trying to reduce all of our jobs to as if they're meaningless, but when people are actually getting up and helping each other rebuild homes, bringing food to each other, helping build bridges, those kinds of things, literally and metaphorically, I think that is the sign of what humankind can be. And you and I have talked about this because we both have this sense that perhaps with what's going to come, there might be quite a moment of transition where there might be a serious unwinding of our structures as they exist now. And that probably will be overwhelming, and we do need to gird ourselves up, as the old expression goes, to be prepared for that and be ready to help each other. But the good news is on the other side of that, because it involves some degree of collapse, that also plants the seeds for our transition to something truly new, something truly promising that's not built on that old faulty foundation, that rotten foundation. So again, this is kind of the paradoxical nature that we get into in this podcast, because as things get dark and nefarious and overwhelming, they also, by their very nature, plant the seeds of a transition and perhaps human civilization 2.0.
Oh, I love that. But I did want to say it was 40 trillion gallons of water, not 4 trillion, which is just like an unthinkable amount. And yes, thank you for saying that, because I've been watching the climate data for at least a couple decades. And you're right. People have been saying, look, this stuff is going to happen, and it's happening. It's not new or novel. It is exactly what was expected. So here we are. But I really love that you so adroitly captured this balance point, right? Because it's true. The darkness is real. It's clear. We're living it. It's on the planet, living with us, trying to do its thing. And we do need to be savvy and thoughtful. And I would suggest everybody out there, make sure you have water on hand. Humans need water. We can't live for too long. It's a gallon per day per person. Just keep that in mind. And at the same time, the opportunity, the thing that most excites us, I'm going to speak for both of us because I know we've talked about this a lot, is not being around for a cataclysm. It's being around for the recognition, awareness, opening, and awakening to what humanity not only is, but can be. Because we are, in fact, these quantum conscious beings who can and do work regularly in the field. We interact with people we love, because of course time isn't real and distance isn't real. There's all these principles of physics that will come to be understood that we're already leveraging as people, and we will continue to be able to leverage, and we will be able, and we are collectively learning about and using to literally create a different reality. And that's why one of the first signs I look for, if I'm, I don't spend a lot of time with a ruler or anything, measuring people's awakening, my own included. But there are some things I always notice, like, if somebody's still really in victim there's a they and they're after us and blah, blah, blah. I mean, to some degree, I'm sure some of that is true. But that is when our inner gaze is fixed there, we basically are just charging it up. So I want to say, you don't need to do that. It's okay. It's okay. And yes, I know we don't really know what's going to happen to our bodies, but we are not these bodies. That's a pretty mature way of thinking about it. And you have to be able to withdraw your gaze from all the things that are commanding it, usually that are negative and scary, and begin to look at what's possible. Look at what you're grateful for. Look at what's beautiful. Look at the love that you have in your life or that you can create. And that's where the service orientation comes in. And I notice, there are a lot of layers. It's not like somebody goes from off to on. And I feel like more and more people have certainly entered that funnel where they're starting the process. And there's a lot of layers of ego dissolution. I mean, that's the biggest challenge, right? Is we have to let things go that we sort of count on to get our bearings here, where we can't really remember everything that we are and everything that is. So you're sort of like, you have to be okay to walk fully in the dark for a while and just keep going and trust. I think that's the process. And it's not just once. Or like you do it, you arrive in a nice, like a nice big lighted cavern, and there's other people, and I go, oh, God, thank God. But then there seems to be chamber after chamber after chamber, but it gets more and more and more refined and more interesting. And it does seem like as people sort of advance in that process, capacity for discernment is there, capacity for steadiness of mind is present, a capacity to decide where you're going to direct your gaze. And rarely do people decide to direct their gaze to things that are negative, because on some level that you're charging it. You're basically pulling it into being by looking at it. But there's also compassion for self and others, because we're human and it's kind of scary, and we're not going to hold that yogi position 100% of the time. We're just not. It's not about that. It's like yoga, when all your yoga teachers say, when you fall out, just get back in the posture when you can. It's okay. And then lastly, I see service. You mentioned that earlier. There is this generosity of heart and this desire to support people around you or others that seems to really grow out of that stance once you can hold it. But it does feel like it's like a muscle, you do have to kind of work it regularly. So that's the other thing I look for in folk. Do you have practices that you use to be steady of mind and to keep coming back? Because it is like going to the gym that way. You can't just decide you're going to get there and suddenly you can lift 175 pounds.
Absolutely. And to that point, you're making me think of something. Number one, I remember when I went through this one experience, I think I might have shared it on this podcast, if not on Liminal Frames, but where I lived in a city one time that had this forest fire that was encroaching upon the city. And on the one hand, everyone thought this is horrible news. People were beginning to lose their homes in the periphery. Homes were being burned down and whatnot, and people didn't know how far the fire was going to extend into the city. But I remember everyone came together so much. And I remember I ended up volunteering to give out vouchers for hotels and food for people who had been displaced from their homes. And what I noticed as I looked around me and I saw everybody connecting, the alchemical nature of the environment was different. And everybody felt it. People, instead of complaining about the police and whatnot, were thankful for all the things they were doing. They were very thankful for the fire department. People were every day, giving each other briefings and then talking about how they could help and whatnot. And I still remember that event to this day. So when we think back on the things that most impact us and remind us of what's important, often it's emergencies, things we think we don't want, disasters. And I've been talking to my class about this a little bit, because when we reflect on our lives, when we're past the life, we're outside the incarnation, we actually remember fully at that point, fully resonate with the notion that we actually came here to experience things, to transmute energy, to grow in soul wisdom. And so it's a good reminder, and sometimes it's these events that we think we don't want, we least want in our lives, that are the things that remind us of these things and help us to work those muscles you're talking about. And even Nathan, my co-host on Liminal Frames, he was one of the people that was heavily impacted by this storm. And I know that he and his wife and their 2 kids have gone to Atlanta while they're waiting for cell service, internet, power, water to be restored to where they live. But they today were going to go back into the Asheville area with their truck loaded up with all these goods, all these resources for people to help people that were still trying to ride it out, that maybe didn't have the ability to go to Atlanta and stay in a hotel or something. So they were touched by, we don't want to just sit it out just because we can. We're going to go back and help those behind. And I'm sure they will come through this being reminded of how amazing it was how people came together. That even as heartbreaking as the experience was, as shocking as it was so compelling and is so compelling when you see people coming together, helping each other. And this is something I think we all sometimes need to experience just so we do remember that. So absolutely, this is, again, the paradox of sometimes the things that seem the most nefarious, the most undermining, the things that seem like are the events we least want to have happen are the things that wake us up. So something to keep in mind.
Right. Yeah, that's so perfect. And, I think, as I said, when my group got together the other night, pretty much everybody was feeling like we are definitely not done. That maybe Helene was a bit of a signal for what's to come. There's more, whether it's climate or our election or the really intense and growing, increasingly intense geopolitical situation, or one of the other various things, technology, what's going on with the sun, what's going on with the solar system, that we all know are out there. We are not done. So it does feel like, as scary as it is, it's more of an opportunity than anything. It's an opportunity to do exactly what you said. And there is massive growth in that. Like, I was just working with a colleague we're doing a project on connectedness and belonging in a way. And there's very interesting longitudinal studies that I think I've referenced before, but we have data from 70 or 80 years of life. Like, we know a lot about what makes a life good. And it's not what you think. It's not how much money you make. It's not how much money your parents had. It's not your IQ. It's not your socioeconomic status. It's not that actually at all. It's the things that are seriously, truly, authentically precious. So if you just entertain the idea for a moment, you are a sovereign soul. You are indestructible. You're having this experience. What's unique about it? It's not the opportunity to make shitloads of money. Sorry. It's not the opportunity to make a lot of money. It can be fun. It's a fun experience as a human. But what makes this experience, especially right now, given the stakes that we're all feeling, is what's precious. And that's what you find in the data. Relationships are the number one factor in longevity as well as a life well lived. And purpose, a sense of purpose. And it does not matter whether you're a CEO or, janitor, dock worker. I don't mean to put those on opposite poles, but, in terms of status and hierarchy, doesn't matter where you are on the social status. It doesn't matter where you are on the scale of social status. It's really about whether or not you feel a sense of resonance, as you said earlier, with your life. And usually it has to do with, are you in the right place to meet the people who are going to contribute to your life in these ephemeral ways that are impossible to measure by the metrics that we typically use around here to identify whether somebody's good or bad. So humans have a ways to go in terms of really understanding what's precious and important, but I feel like we're here. We're on the precipice, and more of us are coming together. And there probably will be more and more events like you just described where we are invited to do exactly what Nathan is doing. And thank you, Nathan and family, to be generous of spirit, to be service-oriented, to exercise compassion, to use your subtle awareness, to use those spidey senses to kind of map out things, what's good for you and others, to really be calm and not inflammatory and not, we don't need to be victims. Even if we are being victimized, we don't need to be victims. That is super important to me because it really affects my life. I can see when I do that. And then acceptance of others. I love that this is another feature of this. I mean, there's so many, I'm finding myself in rooms with people who would never have gathered before together. You've got people who are contactees are getting messages directly from NHI, along with, in rooms with people who were financial advisors and analytical people who would never have talked to people like that. But we're all opening to each other in new ways because we're all having this shared experience of this moment. And I find that to be a part of this design that is just stunningly beautiful.
Absolutely agree. And you're reminding me, I've just been recently rereading all of these letters that were written to John Mack and to Whitley Strieber in the 90s and whatnot. And you see exactly what you're talking about. You see people from different walks of life having the same kinds of experiences, waking up. In other words, being reminded of, resonating with this deeper truth about what they ultimately are, what this ultimately is. And again, some of the people who are the most concerned about coming forward maybe are some of these white-collar workers and whatnot, but they were absolutely having just as transformational an experience as everybody else. The other thing that came up a lot in those letters as I read them is how many people, whether they had an NDE or whether they had contact experiences, felt like that was home. That was a word they used a lot, source and home. And so much so that they didn't want to come back. I think everybody's familiar with the near-death experience literature, where that is very common. People are like, this is amazing. This is actually more familiar, more rooted to who I am in my deepest being, and I don't want to go back to that crazy place. But when they're reminded that they do have a mission, then they're willing to do it, and they recognize that's right. This is going to help me work with energy and grow in soul wisdom. So we have these insights from the quote-unquote other side, where we're reminded what this is about. And we don't, as we're saying, we don't have to just trust that testimony from other people. We can actually resonate with this. And what I mean by resonate is it's something that we deeply already know, and somehow it comes alive in us. It resonates in a certain way when it's somehow in our midst. And again, sometimes in this contrast, in this darkness, something wakes up in us. And for that, we should be thankful. And as you and I keep pointing out, maybe we are different than the crowd in saying this, but we don't want to just keep bumping along good enough. We actually would rather have something transformational happen so that true human potential can come online. And sometimes that does involve some darkness, some difficulty in between, just like what we're talking about with these storms and whatnot. Lastly, I'll say too is I really do think there's a quote-unquote thinning of the veil going on. That again, it's not even just these circumstantial elements for making people realize these things. I really think the nature of the fabric of reality is evolving in some way, and that in itself is causing this alchemical reaction in people because we are part of that fabric, and it's attuning us to some deeper sense from some higher cosmic source. And this is really, really happening, and it's happening even for people that I know they're academics and business people and whatnot. Like you said, it's happening across the board. This is what makes me most hopeful about the future, even though we are facing these existential threats. At the same time, the awakening is really compelling and I think is up to the task.
I love that. That is so true. I mean, I think I've said it before and I'm just struck by it regularly. It's not just that we get to be here to watch this. We are it. Sometimes I've laid and I'm like, God, I feel like I'm being changed from the inside out. Like I can feel something happening on the inside. And I'm not the only one. I know you've had that experience. I've talked to other people. We are the alchemical experience. So every day feels like a different day than the last. And it is really magical, but it is calling us into courage. And I think that is, that's the space we're in right now, because most of us sense, we or know or see. Even if you're not a sensor, you could just look at the data. We are not in a great place. We're likely to have more cataclysms of some sort or another. So it is calling, it's asking each of us, well, how do you want to meet it? Do you want to stay home, proverbially home, stay small and, wait for it to come and get you or not, or hope it passes you by? Or do you want to get your clothes on and go out and meet it? I keep thinking that last year, this was a big theme for me in 2023. And there was literally a time I was laying, I was like, all right, Janice, you're going to curl up in a ball or you're going to get your clothes on. And, I used to read tons of Native American literature as a child or as a teenager. I'm like, and walk out and say, it's a good day to die. Not that I'm suggesting we're going to walk out and die, but you don't know, right? That's the fear. It's like, I don't know what's going to happen to me. Ultimately, I decide the latter. I really do want to meet it, and it makes me lean on my knowing that I am not this body, and I want to be in my fullness as much as possible. But I do think that's a decision we're each getting invited to decide, and I don't think there's a right answer. But this is a question of courage at the moment, especially if you're going to get up and go meet it. And then the last thing I'll say around this is it feels like the one constant is this really does involve working with mind. So to the extent that people can learn how to calm the mind, steady the mind, direct it, watch your thoughts, because thoughts are directionality and emotion is charge. And everything is, like you said, the veil seems very, very thin. So the minute you start to send out thoughts and you give it a little bit of charge, whatever it is, positive or negative, is charge, it's going to show up in one form or another. And there's these interesting ways it shows up in fractals. And if we feel filled with fear, even if it's pockets of fear, we don't really know we're there, then that's what's going to show back up to us. And that does have some interesting parallels into the UAP NHI literature, where it looks like people do tend to see manifestations of something about themselves, and they may or may not be aware of it, right? So, and we're not going to go too far into that, but I think it does point to the mind and working with the mind as the epicenter, especially since if we do end up telepathic or enhancing our telepathic abilities, then we're all going to be pretty visible, because it kind of goes along, you can't really hide yourself when you're communicating with other people.
One of the experiences I've had that are anomalous is basically seeing how even the thoughts we have do impact not only our reality, but other realities as well. That our thoughts have a life of their own, that we are birthing those into the conscious cosmos, and it has impact, and it comes back on us as well. And the last note I want to leave people with that relates to what you're talking about in terms of meeting this moment, putting our clothes on, meeting the challenge, is that when we reflect on people who've had memories of multiple lives, for instance, like I've recently been reviewing the Seth material as part of a feature series I'm doing, and the Seth being, this personality, remembers multiple lifetimes. And he points out that actually the personalities that least resonate with him were the ones where he played it safe, where he bought into the notion this is all there is, and he just wrote it out. Knowing now that this is about becoming who we are by really meeting the moment, transmuting energy, learning these lessons, that's a really good reminder for us to take with us. Because as you said, we are going to have opportunities. The catalysts are going to come. We're going to have increasing tensions in the world, increasing nefariousness, increasing darkness. But on the flip side, those become the catalysts for our growth. So we really want to meet the moment, and we're all here to do it together as a community. And I'm looking forward to seeing how community forms and forges more and more as time rolls out. So that's going to bring us to a close with another edition of the podcast, the 9th edition of the podcast. We hope you'll tune in again in a few weeks' time for Event Horizon.